Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. Today we're joined by Jim Mellon, an entrepreneur, investor, and executive chairman of Agronomics. That's a company that's backing a new wave of companies using cellular agriculture to produce meat, dairy, and other foods without the environmental impact of industrial farming. Agronomics has invested in companies like Meatly, Liberation Lads, BlueNalu, and Meatable. These are startups using cellular tech to provide food with a smaller, lighter footprint. So let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the show, Jim. Can you tell us what is clean agriculture and can it truly scale?
Great question, Felicia. It's very nice to meet you. Thank you for having me. Basically, clean agriculture is the production of foods and materials without reference to animals, except very tangentially, and without the use of hormones, antibiotics, and other nasties in their production. That's why we call it clean food. Some people call it cellular agriculture. Some people call it precision fermentation. We've tried to use this handle clean food because there are, as you know, many people who are against the sort of thing that we're doing. And the idea of cellular agriculture is one that can be attacked in an unfair but negative way and cause the wrong connotations in the mind of the public and in investors.
Yeah, and I think that is a challenge because we have that in so many different industries. The terminology we use can be quite off-putting. But if we're talking about clean agriculture, how does that fit in with ideas and how is it different from traditional or regenerative approaches?
I'm all for regenerative approaches in agriculture, and I think these are complementary. I think the agricultural industry, which is the biggest industry in the world with $5 trillion of addressable market, but growing because of the increasing demands for particularly animal protein from countries such as India and China, is big enough to accommodate the entrance of new ways of doing stuff. So both regenerative agriculture, which I'm absolutely in favor of, and also what we're doing. Now, bearing in mind, we're not involved in the production of plants, which is a very large part of regenerative agriculture. We're only involved in the production of materials, meat, and fish, as well as egg and dairy proteins using the techniques that we have. So we're not involved directly in crop production, and we won't be because there is absolutely no point. Nor are we involved in the production of salads, tomatoes, greenhouse type of products. We're not involved in vertical farming. And most importantly, we're not involved in the production of plant-based foods, which is an unfortunate thing for us because so many people confuse what we're doing with plant-based foods, where they read about the difficulties that Impossible, Beyond, Meatless Farms, Corn, and so forth have had in their journey in the last few years, but we're absolutely not related to that at all. We're doing something fundamentally different. It's daring, but we're getting to the point where we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And, some of the products are now approved. Some of the products are on sale. It is a very exciting time for what we're doing.
I think the point you made about it being complementary is really important to me because we do talk about the importance of regenerative agriculture in terms of the health of the soil, in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of biodiversity, all of these different things. So that complementary approach is it's taking pressure off regenerative or regenerating land and hopefully meeting that demand for animal proteins. Or this kind of protein. You're the executive chairman of Agronomics. And, as I mentioned, it's companies that you've invested in include ones like Meatly and Meatable and Liberation Lands. What is the overall vision? What is the future you're actually betting on?
Well, let's start with my personal passion, which is to reduce the impact of intensive farming and the cruelty and all the other bad things that go along with it. This is not something that most consumers are concerned about. All the multinationals who produce that ultra-processed food or whatever are concerned about, but it's a personal passion for us in this household. We don't eat meat, haven't done for a very long time, and we want to do something to help alleviate animal suffering. You're very well aware that the average chicken is slaughtered at 26 days old. The average dairy cow lives for 2 to 3 years, whereas in a field it would live for 25 years. Cattle go through, they're not gambling in the fields, as you well know, for the most part. They're going through a very horrible process of birth to death. And the impact of the production of foods in those ways is really bad for human health, because 80% of antibiotics go into intensively farmed foods. It causes antimicrobial resistance. We don't know what the exact figure is, but something like a quarter of all emissions, and particularly of the worst emissions, come from intensive farming. And we also know that things like river effluent, the pollution of rivers and so forth, comes from, in large part, especially in the UK, chicken farming. So we have to find an alternative, because we can't go on as we are. So my personal mission, and it's why Agronomics doesn't charge a management fee, is to try and find companies that are going to be world leaders in the technology of replacing some aspects of the worst aspects of the agricultural system that we have at the moment. So can I give you a couple of examples?
Absolutely, I'd love them.
Right. So our company, which is called Clean Food Group, based in Bath, a spin-off of the University of Bath, very well-run business, is very close to producing at scale both palm oil, which is incredibly environmentally destructive, and olive oil, which is subject to droughts in Spain, which is where the biggest production by far of olive oil occurs in the world. And in a relatively short space of time, they'll be producing millions of liters of their product, which is pure, bioidentical to palm oil and to olive oil, but without the nasties involved, and without the deforestation, and without the removal of the habitat of the orangutan, as an example. And they are already garnering the attention of the big companies that use a lot of palm oil, because there is no downside to this. It's bioidentical. It's made using precision fermentation. There's no GM. There's no bad stuff injected into this or put into this. It's not an ultra-processed food. And it's an obvious win for everyone, basically, especially if it can be produced at or below the current cost of production of those oils.
Now, that's just utterly fascinating, because one of the conversations that's going on at the moment is, for the last few years, there's been this idea that people are prepared to pay a green premium, and concern raised that in a period of volatility and high inflation, people aren't prepared to do it. But if you're actually able to produce something that is bioidentical, non-UPF, good for human health, good for water health, lower impact, better for animal rights, and at a price that is the same or lower that's out there, that seems like a complete no-brainer for, at the very least, industrial replacement of source.
I completely agree with you, Felicia. You should be an advocate for agronomics, because you succinctly put all the major points in one sentence there.
Sorry, I interrupted you. That you had a second point.
Liberation Labs is close to completing its factory in the United States. It's in Richmond, Indiana. It's a big factory. It's about $120 million. It was hard to get finance. We at Agronomics and its sister company, New Agrarian, own 52% of that company. And it's producing, or will produce, dairy and egg proteins, which again are bioidentical. And we believe they'll be produced at the same price as the current egg and dairy proteins that are used industrial at the moment, but without any of the nasties and without the same environmental impact that the current production involves. And ultimately, those prices will come down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I'm so excited. That factory will be open at the end of this year. And already a substantial part of its production capacity, it's a contract manufacturer, will be pre-sold, so that, the financial risk is taken away. And then we know that the product will be integrated into the products of large-scale food producers in a very positive way. So, as I said earlier, we're in the
cusp. And can I just say, that is what is so exciting. It's this idea that there is a bioidentical replacement for something that people never see. That Exactly. It is industrial replacement. It is about saying industrialized agriculture doesn't have to be about maximizing every last squeezed drop out of the farmer, but actually allow sources from other places, which will enable, or hopefully allow, the farmers to look after their land in a healthier and more sustainable, and I mean that in terms of longevity, way.
Absolutely right. I mean, another example of what you're saying, and very effectively, is BlueNalu, the fish company. It's producing a bluefin tuna or toro cut, which is supposedly the best cut of tuna, and it'll be on the market, God willing, next year in the United States. with
Wow.
approval. I think they've either got it or they're very likely to get it. And the great thing about that is that obviously we're despoiling the oceans, and we all know about the environmental impact of fishing, and particularly overfishing. But I have a friend, I'm not going to mention his name, but he and his wife during the pandemic went to a particular sushi restaurant every single night during the pandemic because the chef was tested every day for COVID, and
Yeah.
they ate tuna fish. At the end of the pandemic, when it was all like back to normal, he went and got tested by his doctor and was told that his organs were failing because tuna fish contains, which is why you must never eat it more than maximum twice a week, contains mercury, microplastics, and other nasties that can really harm your human health. And obviously it's pure tuna, but it doesn't have any of that stuff in it. And again, it can be produced at $25 a pound and sold to the Japanese, who are going to buy the whole lot of it for years in advance, at $85 a pound. So there's already a profit margin that's substantial, and it allows them to get new investment, build new factories, make more of the stuff in a very sustainable way. So from the beginnings of agronomics, which was just an idea, and I wrote a book about it. We'll send you that book. It's called Moore's Law.
Brilliant.
It's not been totally easy because you have companies that are not as good as other companies, and you have execution risk, scale up risks, and there's still risks involved.
But that's where the expertise and experience comes in, because it's about knowing what is most likely to work, whether it's the team or the structure or the technology or the potential for scaling, or seeing what the problems are. Because I'm assuming that these companies have had similar issues with precision fermentation around supply chain, because that's been something that's, obviously been talked about a lot.
Absolutely. One interesting factor in the precision fermentation business is that there's been no new building of precision fermenters around the world for a long time. And so the average age of what they call the fleet is about 50 years. Can you believe it?
No, that's insane.
Insane, yeah. And the big demand for precision fermentation is from the biotech industry, which is where I've spent the last 20 years. And now the big requirement for these things is to make the GLP-1 agonists, the Wegovy, the Ozempic, the Mounjaro drugs. And so there's no fermentation capacity for food. And that's why we're building this facility, because this is dedicated to food. We're not going to be doing it for biotech. We're doing it for food producers who can't afford to build their own factories or don't want to build their own factories. And we want to build lots and lots of those, because the more you build, and we've got the best team in the world to produce these factories, the better the scale becomes. They become bigger, which is, what is needed to get the prices down to below what I call griddle parity. In other words, the price of
the price of fish.
Well, the price of whatever. And so we have a total of about 20 companies that we backed, and we've started a few of them ourselves. I much prefer the ones that we start ourselves, basically, because you end up just with more influence and control over them, and you're not just with a bunch of other investors and fighting over rights and all that sort of stuff, which I hate. And also, you can identify white space opportunities where other people haven't thought about anything, like clean foods, the palm oil, the olive oil.
The palm oil thing is absolutely fascinating, because there are people who are up in arms about deforestation, and it is incredibly hard to address. I mean, for multiple reasons, but fundamentally, when people locally can make money out of palm oil, they're going to end up deforesting, because the biggest problem in deforestation is actually illegal deforestation. It's a huge issue with legal, but the illegal stuff is what is driving such an increase in deforestation every year.
It is. You're absolutely right. And it's actually tragic. I mean, I visited one of these palm oil plantations in Indonesia, and it's just row and row and row of basically land that's been despoiled. It was formerly, virgin forest that was contributing to the lung function of the world, and now is just a sort of basically a food desert. We can't carry on like that. I mean, it's so what we're looking for, Felicia, is basically what you described as no-brainer ideas that can't really be objected to by any rational person.
Any rational person who understands what the terms you're using mean, because I think there's so much confusion.
That's right. That's why, I'm trying to get the message out as much as possible. I'm just one lone voice, basically. But, people like yourself who understand this, and have got a much wider audience. It's great that you're an advocate for it as well, because everything else I do, I'm trying to make money, as any proper entrepreneur should, because otherwise the businesses won't succeed. We want this business to succeed because we've got external investors who are invested in it, and we invest in other people's companies where the entrepreneurs need to succeed for all the normal reasons of entrepreneurship. But for myself and for Dafina, my other half, this is a total passion project. We are running it, it's being run as a business, but its impact is much more important to us than whatever we receive in the bottom line at the end of the day.
But I do think there's a really important point that is sometimes forgotten in discussions about sustainability. Because yes, there are so many enormous challenges that we face every day and they can feel completely overwhelming. But in order to be sustainable in the current economic system, a business has to make money. Otherwise, it's not sustainable because it has to be sustainable in all of those aspects that enable it to function. So it has to fit in to the framework somehow. And hopefully, as it certainly sounds with what you're doing is displacing things with a higher negative impact. And you're displacing that with something that isn't UPF, that isn't pretending to be something it's not. Well, as I said, it's taking pressure off. I think one of the things that's really interesting to me here is the relationship with farmers. You mentioned BlueNalu, which is making the tuna, and the fish thing really fascinates me because I've been looking at the salmon industry, I've been looking at the tuna industry, and the huge areas of risk that don't seem to really be being addressed, which is not just overfishing, it's what you're feeding them, it's where you're taking fish food from, and the impact that can have on livelihoods in Africa. And, there is a real challenge that I don't think there's a lot of transparency in these industries, and there are big gaps. So we know there's a huge challenge, that cascade effect in other parts of the world just because of the way our industrial fishing works. But farmers, I think there was a global study that was just released about the fact that, farmers, including those in the UK, are increasingly worried about climate change because it's changing weather patterns, which is affecting growth. Whether you like Jeremy Clarkson or not, the fact that he's talking on his farm about the fact that, rains at the wrong time, the whole crop's ruined. It's a huge problem for farmers. It's increasing inequality. It's making things incredibly uncomfortable. How do you see clean agriculture addressing those kind of problems or helping? Basically, what I'm asking is, can these kind of technological interventions take pressure off land and labour while still supporting and enabling sustainable food systems and the livelihoods of farmers?
It's a very good question. So basically, 70% of crops are grown to go into animals, which are very inefficient protein-to-protein producers. We all know that. But 30% goes for human consumption. And that's by far the most profitable part of the crops for farmers. They make much more money by producing salads, tomatoes, fruits, etc., than by producing soya beans that go into a cow or into a chicken. So in that sense, the very precarious farming business is at its most marginal when they're producing crops to go into animals. And animals themselves are a very up and down, very cyclical business, fraught with danger and difficulty because of all the infections that animals in close quarters get.
I think there's also that issue that the global food system is now very interconnected. So problems in Brazil are going to have an impact on the price of beef in the UK. It's just how it works.
100%. And so one of the good things about what we're trying to do is that there's a lot less price volatility in the production of what we're doing because the inputs we know and the input factors don't go up and down like the price of, for instance, wheat or the price of soya beans or the price of cattle or the price of pigs or whatever. So there's that greater security, both for farmers who are subject to the whims of the Chicago markets, which, can be very volatile. And there's also the security of being close to the consumer in the production. So I spend a lot of time in the UAE because they have the combination of an urgent need to improve their food security. They import 95% of their food. And they saw what happened in the pandemic with lots of money, which is the basic requirement to build these sort of alternative protein factories. So the food security for some countries, and it should be also for the United Kingdom, where we import more than half of our food, which is basically the level that we were importing before the Second World War. And we don't remember, but, everyone knows about the convoys being sunk by the submarines and coming across the Atlantic. That was bringing food across to the United Kingdom. Otherwise, the population would starve. If we could produce a high percentage of our food in the UK on farms in part. I mean, this is the other thing. Put the bioreactors on farms. Give the farmers incentives to produce this sort of food. Transfer some of the subsidies they're currently getting to produce food inefficiently into making food on their land efficiently. All sorts of opportunities for farmers to get involved in this. I mean, we would love to be able to do that.
I mean, I think there's a really lovely symmetry there. If you can combine local markets for foodstuffs like salads and human edible crops and a bioreactor that you could perhaps, as a group of farmers, get together and supply industrial food production.
Absolutely. And,
get everyone together. I really like that idea. Sorry, I just think it's very clever.
Farming is not a high percentage of UK GDP, nor is it a high percentage of the number of people who are employed, but it's much bigger in emerging markets, obviously. But what we're trying to do provides much higher quality, less precarious jobs for the population in emerging markets as well as in developed markets. And you use the term no-brainer, which I'm going to use from now on, because in so many instances of what we're trying to do, and, we're just relatively, like an admiral in the Swiss Navy, we're a big factor in a small industry. Most people have never heard of, but we have identified all sorts of areas in which we can be of help to humanity, given the right wins and given investor and consumer understanding of what we're doing. But, Mondelez, which is one of the world's biggest chocolate companies, uses a ton of palm oil, bad for human health, leads to all sorts of health problems.
So I had a look at the sustainability or transition plans of some of the chocolate and the cocoa companies. And one of the key transition strategies is to move to new crop growth areas. But they're all planning on doing that. So how are they going to share out who's going to be where, and how are they going to deal with people who are already growing crops in those regions? It's very challenging. And this is a potential solution to some of that problem.
I completely agree. I mean, the price of cocoa went through the roof in the last couple of years.
It's very
depressing. The price of eggs in the United States trebled last year.
Yep.
All these are pinch points for average, not rich consumers, but average consumers. And all of them can be addressed by producing these products in a different way. Not all of the products produced in a different way, but some of it at the margin being diverted to the sort of things that we're doing. And I find it very annoying when people say, well, you're producing something that's unnatural and so forth. This is as natural as it comes. Rather than an animal being the factory, which is totally inefficient and cruel, where in the case of a cow, 25 times more protein needs to go into it, and that puts out in its life cycle of 1 unit of protein out, we're going to be producing at 2 to 1. And just to give you an example, Felicia, Meatly, which is the company that's got the first cell-cultured meat approval in Europe for dogs, it's in pets at home now, everything is sold out straight away, went deliberately into the dog market because if the owners see that their dogs are thriving and are not dropping dead as a result of it, then they might be more inclined to eat exactly the same product for human consumption in the future. But to show you how this industry has changed and why I called my book Moore's Law, riff off, obviously, Gordon Moore.
Yeah, Moore's Law.
It's law.
I assumed.
It's an outright rip-off, is that they started 2.5 years ago with a litre of what's called media, which is the
stuff you grow cultures in?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so it's got sugar, starches, insulin, blah, blah, blah in it. And the price per litre was 700 British pounds. And then today it's at 20 pence per pound. That's 2.5 years later. And it will be 2 pence per pound by the end of this year. So
That's
now
incredible.
You can see that we will be able to produce exceptionally high quality, non-adulterated, non-interfered with meat, dairy, egg proteins at significantly lower prices than they're currently being produced, because it's obvious that if the input ratio is 2 to 1 versus 7 to 8 to 1 on a chicken or 25 to 1 on a cow, the opportunity for us to revolutionize the price of food is absolutely there. And that's why I keep on supporting this company. I mean, I could just write my books and lounge by the pool, but I'm not making this up. I get up at 4 a.m. and I start work, because this is the first industry I've worked in my life, and later in life, which is having a genuine and very, very positive influence on the future of the world.
Well, I think this is what excited me. It's this idea that there is this area of risk and impact and damage that could be transformed, and you can see how. And especially when you're talking about the stability of price inputs in an era of volatility, that is incredibly exciting. So let's have a look at it from the investment point of view, because, there was one other thing I did want to say, which was when you get criticized and people say, oh, it's not natural. Isn't the history of the human race about getting away from nature to something more comfortable and useful? Because it's natural to go to the loo outside. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, very good point. I never thought of it like that.
Malaria is natural. Yeah. I think when people talk about things like that, what they're doing is misunderstanding what nature is. And actually, if you can take pressure off natural systems with a population the size that we are, that seems like it can only be a good idea. But there are always challenges. So these technologies, I have to be honest, I didn't know quite how far down the line you were, so that's exciting. But these technologies are still emerging. They're still developing. What are the biggest challenges you think they face?
Well, originally we thought regulatory challenge, would the regulators let these things in? And increasingly around the world, these things are being approved, which is great. The second is the usual entrepreneurial, like the scientist who thinks they're a great business person running the company, that sort of challenge. And we have faced them in portfolio companies. And then you've got the scale-up challenge. If this works at 200 litres, will it work at 200,000 litres? Yeah. And increasingly we're seeing that it does, because the laws of physics apply at whatever scale, as long as you engineer it properly. And then there was the cost challenge, and I've mentioned the cost challenge. And there are two big costs. One is the medium, and the other is the bioreactors themselves. Both the prices of those have come down. I mean, the fall in prices is absolutely incredible. And so it's now more of an entrepreneurial challenge. But I mentioned I've been in biotech for the last 20 years. Yeah. So basically, biotech companies are built largely to be sold to big pharma companies, which then distribute and market the drugs that the biotech companies develop. Big pharma doesn't develop many drugs themselves. So if you look at any big blockbuster drug in the last 10, 15 years, it's almost certainly been developed outside of the company that owns the drug, because they bought it.
Well, innovation doesn't tend to work that well in large companies, because the amount of money that it constitutes in terms of its larger income and turnover is so small, it's considered not worth exploring. Whereas if you're an entrepreneur and in the innovation space, what you see is the potential.
And so the same is going to apply in this industry. I'm not saying that every single company that we're involved in is going to be bought out, but I would expect that a number of them will be bought out for their IP. And you can see it already. The big players like JBS, which is going public in New York at the moment, which is the big beef producer from Brazil.
Yes, I know it well.
Has bought a cell line in the United States for $100 million recently. Mondelez, I mentioned earlier, is all over. Meatly is Mars and Nestle, who are the two biggest dog food producers, are all over them. Pets at Home is an investor in the company and is distributing the product. So they know which way the lie of the land is going. What we won't do is to sell to any company that is just determined to shut down the innovation. So in other words, buys the company in order to stop it from going forward.
That's historically that has happened. And I can think of a few industries where it's happened. Where I think it's interesting to look at the small scale innovation and entrepreneurship and these large multinationals is that you can see that national policymakers would want to push forward with domestic manufacturing. So there will be support for that. And if you have an existing global supply chain, you're in a very different position to scale that. So, it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. So we started the company with a net asset value of 5 pence per share. It's close to 15 pence, which in the venture capital environment of the last few years has been extremely good in terms of return. And all of those, amounts are verifiable because they represent the prices at which companies have recently raised money. So they have been raising money, the portfolio companies that we have. Not all the companies are great. We're going to have one or two, I'm sure, that are going to go to the wall, but we'll have some that will be exceptionally profitable. So from an investor point of view, this has been a good outcome. And I think that the real excitement comes in the next 10 years when they move from just being lab companies to being companies that are actually making it scale or being bought or being partnered with big companies and all that sort of stuff. And this is where I have a greater ability really to make things happen, because I've been in finance my whole career, which is now quite a long time. And I know, I know better than most people how to do a deal that is good for both sides and will be good for the Agronomics shareholders. And I'm the biggest shareholder in Agronomics. And every time I can, I buy more shares, and I've never sold a share. So, and I don't intend to sell any shares until everyone sells all their shares, if that happens, or until I'm in my box, basically.
Well, that is a very long-term commitment.
Yeah.
Which is obviously encouraging to hear. Now, we're talking about clean agriculture, so agriculture as a global opportunity. What are the sorts of policy or investment shifts or even infrastructure shifts that you think are needed to make that vision of replacing a lot of industrial food inputs accessible to everyone? Not just the global north, but the global south. Are there things that need to be in place, or do you think it will happen naturally?
I think you're going to see the proof of concept in the new plant that we're building in the US will be very important for the industry. And it's actually got some US government support now. The Department of Defense, believe it or not, is invested in it.
Actually, that makes more sense to me than almost anything else, because the Department of Defense has always invested in renewable energy, new technologies. An army marches on its stomach has been a truism for hundreds of years, probably longer. So it actually makes sense that they would be interested in new technologies around food.
Yeah. I mean, and then the USDA has given a soft loan for the project as well. So that's really important to get that endorsement and also hard cash to build out what is something that is very difficult for investors to contemplate because it's the first of its kind. So I invested in myself quite a lot of money in it, separate to Agronomics, because Agronomics didn't have enough money to do it. So I don't know how much money we'll make out of it, but I'm quite optimistic that it'll be a good investment, not a artificial intelligence type investment. The other big challenge, and to get back to your point, is that we're competing with insane valuations for amounts of money going into AI.
Yeah.
When companies are being bought for 10 billion, they've only been started last week. I mean, I think it's insane, but it's a big competition for the available capital out there.
Yeah. The thing I think is important to explore here is a shift I'm beginning to see. Now, we know about the complexities around AI. We know about the difficulties around regulation. We know about the energy consumption. We know about the potential for helping us cut emissions. It's one of those very complicated areas. You're seeing a lot of empirical evidence of companies having bought in big AI and reorganizing their workforce. But the projects haven't worked quite as well and they're hiring people back. And I think there's a lot of confusion around AI in a similar but more extreme version as there was around digital in the 90s. Without a doubt, it shifted the market and it changed the dynamic. But a lot of those companies are not going to succeed, or they will be bought out and shut down one way or another. What I am seeing more of, and it's possibly because I'm in the climate nature bubble, but what I'm seeing that I find really interesting is this re-emergence of awareness that not every investment can be a tech investment, that you can't expect to have 6 investments of which 2 have a rate of return of 25, 30%, and even the bad ones will probably sell to somebody else. There's a real growing interest in hardware, which I saw that issue around renewables sort of 15, 20 years ago. It's hard. It needs patient capital. It's difficult to do. You need the right sorts of experts. But I think what I am seeing is an acknowledgement in the investment community that if we are going to transform industrial systems, and fundamentally, if we're going to transform systems, we're going to have to transform industrial systems, that means we have to learn to build factories. And that kind of connects to a lot of what we're seeing, I think, politically around nationalism and the idea that you want things rooted in your own country. And it's almost as if we live in such a volatile and confusing time that actually investing steadily for things that are actually built and will provide fundamentals that you can track and watch and measure and see could actually be, I mean, obviously there will always be some investors who are into that, but actually it's quite a good portfolio extension opportunity, because if you're in just looking at AI because that's what everyone's doing, what are you missing?
Well, I think you put it. Yeah, I think you put it. I think you put that perfectly. You'll be familiar with all these renewable infrastructure funds that were listed in London a few years ago. Then really cratered, and you were getting yields of 10, 12% on them. Quite recently, I bought some myself, and now you're seeing a lot of activity with the Ontario teachers buying up them because they get the predictable yield from a solar farm portfolio or from a wind farm or whatever, and it makes a hell of a lot of sense. But if we're going to tackle climate change, and by the way, I'm completely with you that we have to. I mean, just sitting here with no water and a boiling environment just tells me that if this is the crisis of our times, one key aspect of that is agriculture, which is not much often talked about. It's aviation might be 1 or 2%, agriculture is 25%, and you can readily do something about it. So let's do it.
That's quite an inspirational way of looking at it. And part of me kind of wants to end our interview on that note because it sounded so good. But I do actually want to think about ask you rather, about how we go about changing perceptions. What do you think the biggest risks and misconceptions around clean agriculture are right now, either for investors, on the tech side, consumer perception? Do you think it's what we talked about earlier, that people just don't understand what it is?
Yes, I think that's it. There's the conflation I mentioned earlier between the plant-based food companies, the meatless farm which went bankrupt, and Impossible Beyond and all their travails. Yeah. Also, you had big companies in the US that were involved in the sort of stuff we're involved in that raised a ton of money, squandered it. Companies like Perfect Day, Upside Foods, Just Company, they're now on their sort of knees, and they do not help the industry even though we never invested in them, it doesn't help because people look at the newspapers and read about the failure of these companies, or maybe not failure, but the kind of relative failure of these companies. And so we just need a lot more advocacy. But what we do know is that the young generation are absolutely up for trying this stuff. You mentioned very astutely at the beginning that stuff that consumers don't see, like dairy and egg proteins, going to bread or confectionery or whatever, people don't really care whether it comes from a cow or it comes from a precision fermentation vat. So the Meatable company, which is our Dutch meat company, is making meat that will go into sausages, patties, pasties, that sort of thing, or mixed with vegetables into pies or whatever. And that is a very good gateway. And I think also like the Meatly product for dogs is a very good gateway because...
Well, as you said, if people see their dogs eating it and be fine, they'll be happier. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, we've got videos of dogs and cats eating this stuff and they wolf it. It's absolutely delicious for them. So, I think it's just going to be a question of time, but it's not helped by Luddite behavior from, for instance, the French or the Italians. The Italians have banned cellular agriculture because, it's interfering with Parma ham or foie gras in France and all this sort of nonsense. It's absolutely crazy.
But I think that, I get that you think it's crazy, but I also understand that for people who, I'm just thinking about Italy, where food is such an important part of the culture and the relationship with food and the land is so important, that fear of taking over Parma ham or doing a fake Parma ham would be horrifying. But that's an education issue. That's a knowledge issue, because you're not talking about that. You're talking about replacing industrial inputs. At least that's the impression. I mean, not with the tuna. I know that's going to go to Japan. But that, for me, is the really exciting bit, because it's taking one thing out and slotting something in so it doesn't have to be a concern for people. And it simply keeps prices stable in an unstable time, which, again, as I go back to, seems like a no-brainer. Now, I have a question, actually, which I think we've already answered, but I do want to ask it because it's in relation to this, the shifts in industries, digital AI. Do you worry about hype outpacing reality with the potential for these ideas? I think I'm answering my own question here when I say probably there isn't too much hype around this because there has been so many issues in other types of businesses. But there is an interest. There are these drivers that come. You said it over the next 10 years, when these companies are going to have an impact. So do you think there is a chance of hype outpacing reality? And as an investor, how do you filter out the signal from all the noise?
Yeah, well, we have avoided the big disasters so far. I don't know if that's luck or skill or just, being aware of relative valuations. I mean, personally, I would never invest in any of this AI nonsense at the moment because you rightly point out, they're going to be like the railroads in the 1850s and 1860s. There'll be plenty of money going into them, but no one's going to make any money on the way out. And, all of them went bankrupt, all of them, 1880s and 1890s. And I think we're going to find the same with this, they're basically doing the same thing and they'll have similar outcomes, which is marginal or no profitability. And as usual, the sort of Silicon Valley mafia will be the ones to make the money out of this. And the retail investors will get stuck like they did in the internet boom, holding the baby. Now, it would be good if we had a bit of hype around what we're doing because we do need to raise a lot of capital. We need money to build the factories, to get new. I mean, this is not a one-dimensional replacement, because you can imagine that if we can make meat or fish or eggs and dairy protein, you can make variants of those which have got inbuilt stronger healthy characteristics or are mixed up. Like this Australian company, Vow, is recently making quail meat, believe it or not. It's also doing, I think, crocodile meat. It's doing some sort of weird stuff. But
Wow.
you can engineer, and without using GM, by the way,
Yeah.
some characteristics, including taste, which will just be compelling for humans. And actually, I think that's going to be the future. There'll be new types of meat and fish that will be just so unbelievably delicious that, notwithstanding the way in which it's made, people will want to eat it. And we don't need everyone to do it. We need 1 or 2% of the population, and you're there, basically.
It's very true. I think there is a challenge around the word engineer, because I think that does make consumers nervous.
I know. I need to find a different word for that. But, this is a process. And thank you for putting me in the right direction.
The thing is, this is part of the struggle, because what you're talking about is a complete transformation of the food system. How the hell do you start with that? Because you've got all this embedded structure, you've got legacy approaches, you've got lobbying, you've got not invented here problem, you've got investor concern about something they don't understand. So my last question for you really is, what gives you hope right now? What's the one thing that makes you believe this future of clean agriculture is possible?
Well, it has gone from looking at the equivalent to the drug development business, which I'm in. You have the preclinical, what they call animal models, which I disapprove of, but where they test stuff in rats and mice and so forth. And 1 in 25,000 of those molecules will get through to the next stage, which is phase 1 human testing. And then every phase subsequently, you're getting
things drop out,
fallouts and huge amounts of expense. This industry has now got beyond phase 3. It has products. It is ready to go. It just needs capital. It needs good people to execute. It needs not government support in the sense of subvention, but government understanding that, as you rightly pointed out, this can be a source of high value-added jobs, reduction in emissions, and all sorts of good things attached to it, including improvement in human health, which is a disaster in our country where the NHS is straining because of all the problems that come from eating the crap food that is being peddled to the large part of the population. And so that's what gives me hope. We are now at the cusp of seeing this thing going from being a little chrysalis to being a full-fledged butterfly. And I am personally very excited. I want to stay alive to see my dream come true.
That is the perfect note to end our interview on. Thank you so much for your time, Jim. I literally could talk to you for hours. To our listeners, I say thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. I hope you've learned new and interesting things, and we will be back soon.